Arch Linux, notorious for being the most
challenge.
difficult
So
distro
many
to install,
YouTubers
or
have
restricting
worked on
during
it.
updates.
Get stuffed, Apple, and especially Microsoft, right? You know why? I'm turning into a penguin.
Right now, it seems like everybody is doing a switch to Linux video. I thought after the Linus Challenge 2 or so years ago, we were basically done with this. But no, I guess has to come back around every so often. Now, I could make an individual video on each of these different situations, but frankly, a lot of what is being said is basically the same thing over and over again. So instead of doing that, what I decided to do is go through, watch all of these videos, and put together a collection of common things that are being said, common issues that people had, and talk about whether they have solutions, whether these are actual problems, or just a general lack of understanding of how Linux actually functions. Now, if you're new to the channel and don't know who I am, I have been daily driving Linux for about 5 or so years now, and for that entire time, I have been using Arch Linux. This is not to say that everybody should use Arch, or Arch is the best distro. It is, but that's not the point. I have run into a lot of issues myself, and a lot of the problems that are being brought up here, I have certainly seen myself. Let's start off with the big one. You know it, I know it, everybody knows it.
Let's talk about Photoshop.
Now, normally I would say you don't actually need Photoshop. You would just bring this up as an excuse for not wanting to use Linux. But we're not talking about random people making excuses here. We are talking about people operating in a creative field where they are using Photoshop for their job. And some people here are familiar with Inkscape. One person actually discovered that Photopea exists. But whilst I personally do use GIMP, and GIMP is a reasonable tool once you get used to using it, it is not a Photoshop one-to-one replacement. It is missing a lot of equivalent features. It is missing a lot of basic features, like multi-layer selection is only coming up in the new version. Non-destructive editing is only coming up in the new version. It's got a weird layout out of the box, it's got some odd hotkeys, and honestly, learning GIMP is a challenge series unto itself. You can't just easily replace something like Photoshop if your entire workflow is built around using it. Now, video editing is also in a pretty bad situation, but not as bad. And I don't just mean, oh, you could use Kdenlive or Shotcut. Kdenlive and Shotcut are basically the same tier as GIMP. What I mean is this.
It's fortunate that in video editing and VFX, there are actually a number of professional apps written natively for Linux, which brings us back to dumping Adobe Premiere for DaVinci Resolve.
I am honestly surprised by how many people this time around have talked about using DaVinci. I remember last time there was a lot of Premiere and other things like that. I guess Adobe has annoyed enough people that they're at least willing to get rid of that one part of it. And yeah, Resolve is available on Linux. Asterisk, 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 giant pile of salt, pray to the gods it's actually going to work, because Resolve has a number of issues on Linux. The free version is a bit of a mess. For example,
when I do recordings with OBS, there would be no problem with the normal playback, but when I'd import it into DaVinci Resolve, there would be no audio. Apparently, AAC isn't supported in Resolve for Linux.
Yeah, this is entirely a free version Resolve issue. So my understanding is AAC support on Linux is done with some reverse engineered drivers, and most of the applications on Linux make use of those drivers. Resolve doesn't want to do that. They want to use their own special source solution that is only included in the paid tier, which has a little bit of a very high price tag attached to it. However, even if you work around that, there is still a number of other issues, like the application sometimes just breaking your encoding, it not opening, it being an absolute nightmare to install on anything besides the specifically supported distro it wants to work on. If you want to install it on something Arch-based, you're probably going to have to manually edit some package builds. If you want to use the beta build, that's probably going to be out of date. And because Arch's dependencies always misalign with the thing it's actually built against, it might just not work anyway. And here's something for the GNOME developers who insist on client-side decorations.
Like I mentioned in my podcast setup in OBS, I had some window management issues with DaVinci Resolve as well, in that you can't, like at all. DaVinci Resolve, for whatever reason, doesn't maximize or resize inside of Linux. At least, not that I could figure out how to do it. It doesn't even have the maximize, close, and minimize icons in the top right of the window, let alone the ability to drag the window around or grab it and resize it.
This is what happens when you insist on client-side decorations and an application developer just says, we don't care to support your broken platform. And if we're talking about big things, we cannot forget the one that ends up biting so many people.
The reason I'm using Nvidia is simply because it's the most rational choice. I built my computer first and foremost to excel at video editing, and Nvidia cards, especially the 4090, are by far the most performant and optimized when it comes to that. If I were...
It's all well and good to say AMD drivers better, just get AMD. A lot of people when they switch to Linux are just using the system they already had. Now, the Nvidia experience on Linux has had a very rocky history, but as of late, things are getting a lot better, especially on Wayland with the 550 and 555 drivers. But whether you have access to those drivers out of the box is gonna depend on what you're actually using. If you're using an LTS release of Ubuntu, well, you know, you're on an LTS release of Ubuntu. If you're on something like Pop! OS, you'll have a much better experience. If you're on something like Arch, a much better experience. But it's still in that situation of transitioning from being really bad to where it should be. I'm not going to say exceptional, but like baseline good. But at the same time, I'm now seeing reports of the opposite happening over on the X11 side.
I had those X11 graphical glitches even on Arch Linux, so Cinnamon was out of the question as well, which once again brought me back to i3.
And of course, there's been long-running issues like screen tearing that are just never going to be resolved. There are technically ways to deal with on X11, but it's hit and miss whether it actually works. But whilst we're on the topic of GPU drivers...
Weird issue I ran into with these drivers was that these randomly disappear and stop working. Everything that uses these drivers refuses to work, and I eventually need to reboot my PC. Anyways.
I've had the exact same thing happen with AMD GPU drivers as well. OBS just sometimes breaks. It sometimes forgets that drivers actually exist. Usually just doing a reboot fixes it. Sometimes there's like a mismatch of the application version and the GPU drivers, so doing an update there usually fixes it, but it's just messy. GPUs are just messy. At the end of the day, when we're talking about these Nvidia driver issues, it is up to Nvidia to actually get them resolved. The reason that AMD is a smoother experience on Linux isn't some magic that AMD has done. It's because things are developed in the open, it's easier to test, it's easier to modify, and it's easier to ensure that the developers aren't doing something really, really stupid that everybody else has to account for. But before we completely move on from OBS, one more thing.
Although it installed with ease, but it wasn't recognizing my screen. So after a few hours of debugging and a Stack Overflow solution, we were good. Now to use H.
You might have noticed that little thing right here. This is a Wayland user. So, Wayland and screen capture works, right? Like, I'm doing it right now. That's what you're seeing when you're seeing my screen. The problem is there's still a couple of kinks here and there. Sometimes the portals just die and they crash and OBS needs to be restarted, or you need to restart the portal, or there's like another portal running in the background that's conflicting with the portal, which can happen if you have multiple desktops installed. Basically, sometimes things just don't work. Sometimes they just don't work. Usually you can just restart things and they start working though. Now this next point always gets brought up, but it seems like it's a lot less often this time around.
More from that, it's like a lot of things have like a curve, like the learning curve, you know, like as you want more from it, it gets harder. Well, Linux is more like this. It's a learning cliff. And you go, dum 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 dum. Oh, what's this? Oh, it's called Terminal. This is like the lifeblood of Linux. Like,
Random DistroTube.
you want to do nearly anything like that's beyond just browsing the internet, you're going to be in Terminal, and you've got to learn how to like do script and whatnot. And to people who've lived and grown up with this and work,
Yes and no. Like, you can go about your day never interacting with a terminal. If you want to go and install software, every major desktop and every distro ships the application software center thingy, whatever the desktop calls it, a GUI for installing software. And that's the main thing you're going to use the terminal for anyway. File browsing, video editing, image editing, most of the things, you never have to interact with the terminal. Now you can, and there usually are CLI tools out there that you can use if you want to. Where you really need to interact with the terminal, though, is where there are these, like, weird edge cases where things don't necessarily work. Like, hey, there's a driver for this, but the driver is weirdly configured out of the box. You gotta go and run this, like, weird command that changes some random setting. In those cases, yes, but most of the time, you can use it like Windows, you can use it like macOS, and just pretend like the terminal doesn't exist. But not everything is negative.
I got the confidence to really jump into Linux after the Steam Deck. The fact that it's got like a desktop mode and it's just a computer. It's fine. It's got everything you need, like keyboard and mouse straight into it and the external display. I've happily lived out of this, and that's what really inspired me to have a good old go at it. So Ubuntu, I find...
Also, he says Ubuntu wrong. Just ignore that. I am really happy to see that people with no experience using Linux, or very minimal experience using Linux, are trying out the desktop mode on the Steam Deck. I haven't been using my Steam Deck as much as I should be. I've been playing way too much Path of Exile, but KDE is in a really good state, and Valve has built some really nice integrations with their desktop, with the Steam Deck, and made everything just like a nice package that works together. And it's given people this idea that Linux isn't actually that hard to use. With that being said, I don't think this should be your takeaway.
Well, is Linux going to be completely mainstream given how like miserable Windows is and whatnot? No, not until SteamOS is just something that you can download and put on your computer instead of Windows. SteamOS...
You do not understand how many times I've heard people say this. SteamOS is a customized distro that makes a lot of sense for the Steam Deck hardware. Much like the operating system on a PS5 makes a lot of sense for a PS5. If you turn that into a generic thing that could run on any PC hardware, it wouldn't be any different from any other distro out there. Yeah, there's a couple of nice little gaming tweaks here and there, but for the most part, it's literally just a regular distro. Yes, it is an Atomic distro, but there are a lot of Atomic distros out there now. If you want something more catered towards gaming, try out UBlue Bazet. But on the flip side of that, I do understand this annoyance.
For the most important question, which distro did you go with? Drum roll, please.
Obviously, it's going to be Arch.
I went with the wrong one. That's right. It doesn't matter what I chose. People would still complain. Some of you are so passionate about the Linux distro that you use that you actively hate when people use other ones. Like, you're on the same team here.
Yup. This is very, very, very true. It can be confusing. People can be tribalistic. I like to joke about Arch Linux, right? Like, I honestly don't care if you want to use Arch or don't want to use Arch. I would honestly recommend against it if you're a beginner user and don't want to mess around with stuff in your terminal. But at the end of the day, use whatever makes sense for what you're trying to do. Now, the problem is if you're new, you don't really have the criteria and the knowledge to understand what makes sense for what you're trying to do. But frankly, any of the major distros are gonna be pretty much fine. If you do gaming, I would recommend leaning more towards something like Pop! OS just to make sure drivers are up to date, but if you don't game, literally anything's gonna be fine. And since we're here, let's talk a bit about gaming.
There's something which I didn't mention in the previous video at all, which is gaming, but I actually did try a bit of gaming on the Fedora 39 setup at the end of 2023. The first game I tried was CS 1.6, which worked perfectly.
Very modern video game, by the way.
Fine, even on i3, though for whatever reason, it did default to my secondary vertical monitor at first. I also joined a server and had...
Yeah, i3 can be weird sometimes. There's like random little things you gotta make sure you configure. Like, I wouldn't recommend doing window managers for like beginner users. Liverkivi's been using Linux like on and off for a bit, so like very different situation. He decided to try out Arch this time, so like not the average experience we're seeing here. Now for me, outside a couple of exclusives and random games I got cheap on console, most of my gaming is done on my Linux machine. But I'm not really into like competitive shooters and other games that have very heavy anti-cheat. Most of what I play is, as you saw, weeb garbage, single-player action RPGs, and a lot of Path of Exile, all of which works great. But I understand I am not the average person, though.
Also, you can see I can't play League of Legends. Now, while some of you may argue that is a good thing,
I would.
It's the only game I play, and it just won't run on Linux now due to their new anti-cheat program that runs...
Not just League, I think basically everything that Riot does that's a multiplayer game. So, yeah. Now, being YouTubers, there is a lot of people buying hardware that most people just frankly aren't going to buy. As such, you run into issues like this.
Something else that would be a common theme that I discovered in the first few days is that you have to do actual research when you buy a piece of hardware. I have an Insta360 webcam, and their software to control the position and visual settings doesn't exist for Linux. This is never a problem in Windows or Mac OS because you just
sometimes problem on Mac OS, but generally no.
Assume the software will be supported, and 99% of the time you're right. Luckily, the default position...
Yeah. On Linux, most of the time it's fine, because most of the time things are using like normal, sensible drivers, or somebody has gone out of their way to make support for that hardware. But there are absolutely cases like this. I think a great example of this is the Stream Deck, the Elgato Stream Deck, not the Steam Deck. It's like a streaming pad thing. It has like a bunch of keys on it, and for a long time, that just didn't work on Linux. Until one developer was like, I have a Stream Deck, I want it to work, and he went out of his way to write a driver for it, to write software to control it, and now you can actually use it. And a lot of the time, if you're buying things that are like weird out of the box, they rely on specific software, you do need to at least think a bit about it. One thing I'm really surprised about is this time around, a couple of people went and tried out Hyperland. And when they tried out Hyperland, they all ran into the exact same problem, a problem I've criticized Vaxer about, and I've told him is an actual problem, and you can't pretend like it doesn't exist.
I gotta know that Hyperland doesn't support dragging and dropping of files among two apps. It does in few, but not every app. So
there is a problem going between X-Wayland and Wayland Windows. Now, it's one thing if you don't want to fix it, right? Like, you can say, I don't want to fix it, that's fine. But don't pretend like you can just replace everything with a Wayland to Wayland window. There are a lot of cases where you need to use X-Wayland. But I am really glad that people are treating this as a lot more of a learning experience than what happened in the Linus challenge.
About a week in is when things started to go downhill, because this time around I didn't want to just survive the Linux challenge. I wanted to really learn the ins and outs of Linux. What's a kernel? How do package managers work? What's the actual difference between distros? It sounds good and all, but when you're forcing yourself into this while also slowing down your existing workflows and not being able to use specific softwares, it gets frustrating very quickly.
Yeah, if you try to take on too much at once, like, this is how I did it, right? Like, I was in the middle of university, I switched to Arch in a semester, I was doing my assignments and learning Arch at the same time. I would not recommend doing this approach. I would recommend getting used to a GUI and then trying out little things here and there. Like, oh, what does this do? How do I do this? What's a terminal-based approach for this? Oh, let's try this thing. Doing everything at once, you can make it happen, right? But like, it's a much bigger commitment, and you have to be willing to have things break then. All in all, a lot of the issues I saw are kind of what I would expect, and in many cases, the kinds of issues that I run into as well. But whilst a lot of these people aren't going to keep using Linux, it does seem like the vibes are generally getting better. People aren't using it and thinking, oh my god, this sucks, I can't do anything, why is everything broken? Why did I try to install Steam and it deleted my desktop? Pop! OS is never going to be able to live that one down. That was insane. I have no idea how they shipped a version like that. But people are having a reasonable experience, and most of the problem now are things they want are missing. Like, software they need is missing. And that's much better than what we had before. Every single day, things are getting better and better and better. Sometimes we stumble along the way. Sometimes there is things that are like held up because bike shedding and all this dumb stuff. But if you come back a year, 2 years, 5 years from now, you're going to have a better experience than you had before. And that's honestly all that matters. So let me know. Are you a Linux user? Are you a new Linux user? What is your experience? And have you run into some problems as you've gone along the way? Are there problems that other people have experienced, or are they unique to your system? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Pay, linked in the description down below. Also, go and subscribe to all of the channels I showed in the video. They're all great.